Hi, all. My name is April Levitt. I work in FSU University Libraries. I am an assistant university librarian. I'm also overseeing our research strategy and collaborations for the FSU Health Data Science Initiative. Prior to that, I worked in the vice president's office as a strategic planner and data analyst. And in that role, I had to produce a lot of reports for multiple stakeholders. Uh, and Qualtrics became one of my favorite tools alongside Power BI. So I would often use Qualtrics to collect data, create my surveys, create my forms, collect information and data from stakeholders, from students or participants. And then I would have to turn around and create these comprehensive reports, usually for leadership, for institution leadership, but sometimes for different stakeholders, including the students themselves. And so I often use Qualtrics, and I often use it in combination with Power BI. But those are two of my favorite tools. I use other tools as well when I need to. And just depending on what type of data analysis I'm doing, if I'm doing really inferential analysis, or a lot of times if I'm just doing descriptive statistical analysis, I'm just doing that through Excel and through Power BI. I'm not having to go into my SPSS programs or SAS programs. And so today what I want to show you is something I didn't get to show you last week because I was really sick during the dissertation boot camp. And so I'm grateful to Jeff Phillips for kind of filling in and showing you some of the ropes in Qualtrics and some of the capabilities and what it can do. I've used it for plenty of projects before, not just surveys, but I recently helped a doctoral student in the College of Business use it as almost a health tracker app. And so kind of working through how to create that Qualtrics as a online form that function much like an app would, without having to go through the cost and through the time and effort it takes to develop an app. That was kind of a cool project to do. So it has a lot of capabilities, and I'm grateful to Jeff for filling in for me when I was so sick last week. Now that I'm back, he just asked if I could go over one of the parts that he didn't get to in terms of how to look at your data when it comes out, however it's exporting out of Qualtrics. If you've ever used Qualtrics, you know that your data is going to export. And I'm going to show you the various ways that you can export, and then just very basic what I do to start cleansing and preparing my data to upload it to a different program for analysis. I'll look at it again in a basic manner. So in something that I would want to do, like a descriptive statistics, not really. Sometimes I'll have to do some binary coding of my data points when they come out of Qualtrics, but we're not really going to look at that today. I just want to show you all some tips and tricks I have for preparing that spreadsheet and really digging into the data management in a way that will be productive for you. If I'm not going to go over I'm not going to go in depth or into a lot of details. So if you get to a point where you have this survey and you have data that you collected and you're like, oh, I really need some help just thinking through how to clean my spreadsheet and prepare my data for analysis, I'm really happy to help you do that. If you want to reach out for a consultation, I'll include my email when I send this video to Jeff. So right now, I'm just going to share my screen. I hope I do this the right way so that you'll be able to see multiple screens as I pull them up. Right now, what you're looking at is a very old survey I did, an orientation survey, just because I know that it has responses. And I know that it's kind of there are multiple variations, a variety of different questions. Because it's a little bit older, I didn't really dive into some of the newer features that the new version of the Qualtrics software offers. So what we're really looking at are very basic types of questions, your multiple choices, your single multiple choices, your check all that apply, your multiple choices, your short answer text, and I don't think I really put any essay text in here. We'll go briefly over some of your options if you do have some open-ended text answers in your Qualtrics forms. But right now, just what you're looking at is it's the blocks of an old survey that I have that I know has the answers, responses to it. And just so you can see what that looks like, the questions are within each block. This is really something I do. Again, I'm not going to dive really into Qualtrics because Jeff went into that last week, but creating blocks is a way that makes it easier specifically on the researcher, because they are able to kind of parse out what their blocks of questions are like, and it kind of makes it easier to edit and organize your question blocks in the Qualtrics system. I really like that form of organization they provide. So just so you can see what it looks like, we have some open-ended text options here. We have some Likert scales. There's also some multiple choice questions in here. So again, just really basic. What you want to do once you have closed out your survey, you're done with your collection period. You want to go into your survey, open up your survey, and then go to data and analysis so that we can export this. And I will be exporting today to an Excel spreadsheet, but Qualtrics does give you a lot of options when you export your data. So you would want to go to export data, and then you can choose any of these. You can choose a TSV and a CSV file. You can choose Excel, XMLs. You just want to go straight to SPSS. That's also an option to be able to download straight to a statistical analysis package. It can get a little tricky if you are using FSU's SPSS packages and you do not already have a desktop version. I don't know how the stab file downloads, or if it's an easy download if you're using the virtual lab, if you're downloading and then having to import into your virtual lab. To be honest, I haven't tested that, but it does offer that option. It also offers you to allow you to download a spreadsheet straight to your Google Drive, which is interesting. For me, I'm just going to today use Excel, and then I'm going to click download. And what that does is it will download for you. You can see I already did this so that we don't necessarily have to wait on the Excel file, although it didn't take that long since I already downloaded it, which is great. Sometimes you might expect if it's just sitting there and loading and loading and loading. If it is a large file, you can see over here that I have almost 5,000 responses. That's a relatively small file, but if you have a larger file, it might need more time to download and to export for you. Otherwise, you might just check your internet speeds if it just seems like the little thing is like downloading. So let's open up this spreadsheet. Let me see. I hope that you'll be able to see this. Screen sharing. What am I sharing? Okay, perfect. It looks like you can see my spreadsheet. Let me try to blow this up just a little bit so you can see it. Again, all I really want to do today is go over what an export from Qualtrics will look like if you're building out your survey. Or I'm sorry, not if you're building it out, if you are done with your survey. Essentially, you're going to see this once you export your data file from Qualtrics with all of your responses in it. These are all standard for Qualtrics. All of these that are front loaded. You have start date and end date of the survey. So it'll show you that for some people, that information is really important and that timestamp is really important. It'll also give you a status response, an IP and IP address. If you mark on your research that that your survey is anonymous and it's truly anonymous, when you're in Qualtrics, there is a button you can click that will not record your IP address. And I highly recommend doing that if you are submitting your research to the IRB and you're saying this is anonymous, it's not confidential, it's straight up anonymous. I'm not going to be having any identifiers tagged on this information at all. Then you want to go in and check that so that you won't get that IP address back with you. Here is your progress bar, which is important because it gives you a percentage of the survey that was actually completed. In this column G, I'll come back to F in a second, but in G, it tells you if it's finished, if it's true or false. This, depending on how you have outlined your methods of research, if you have indicated that you will not be accepting partial responses to your surveys, then you can go in here and you can filter out all of your false, because if it's false, it means that it wasn't finished. So these people did not take the time to actually finish off the survey. That may not be important to you. In your methods, you may have selected, or you may say that you'll be recording partial responses. If that's true, I recommend that as a doctoral student, you do outline in your methods section, in your chapter that talks about methods, that you outline what is a partial response that you will accept. Because when you come into Qualtrics, you'll be able to filter out any partial responses that you won't accept. You may accept all of them. Somebody may have 2% response rate and you might accept that partiality, right? So they might have barely answered anything, but you're like, no, I said I'm going to accept it. I'm going to accept it. One of the things that you want to think about, again, in terms of your research methods and how your analysis methods, how you're going to be looking at your data, is that if somebody does, if you accept partial responses on your surveys, then you need to know that it's going to be more difficult especially if you're creating a comprehensive report. You're maybe not just looking at certain variables together, but if you're creating a comprehensive report, it's going to be a little more difficult when you do partial responses to say like, okay, well, this person only answered through question 10. This person answered all the way through question 17. But when I compare the results of question 17 and the results of question 10, I'm going to have one more participant on question 10 overall than I did answering question 17. And that's all I can report. It's not a bad thing. It's really just how you want to set up your research design and how you need to talk through that when you're talking about your results and your findings in your publication. So I wanted to highlight that. So I use this often, especially if I'm like, okay, it's 100% responses or nothing. And I usually do that if it's something that's a quick report, or that I have cautioned my users on the beginning end in the consent form that, hey, if you stop filling this out, I'm discarding all of your partial responses. They won't be counted at all. So you want to warn people too. Also, if you're not going to count their partial response, you want to make sure they know up front in their consent form. The other thing I want to show you all is the duration field, which I think is really important, especially when you all saw at the beginning and you were looking at an old orientation survey where we were looking at the responses from students who had gone through FSU's orientation process. It was really a kind of a satisfaction and learning outcome survey. And so we're measuring all of the things, trying to obviously make the programming better, but also we wanted to know if there were any learning outcomes that were achieved by our students and that our programming helped to facilitate. In that, when I created that, especially because it was a longer survey, but also just because we want to know how long it's going to take people to take this. When I did the test, and I'm going to say you don't have to do this, but I highly recommend that if you have a survey you're going to send out, that you're sending this to people to test and to try to break for you. The goal is that you want to be able to send it to some trusted stakeholders, maybe colleagues or peers in your cohort, and ask them to take the survey for you. You want them to try to break it, because if they find somewhere that it breaks, then you want to fix that before it goes out to your subject pool, to your participants, who you need to be responding to your survey. So when I do that and I get those tests back, you can see some of these, like this is a test because, we know because it says test here. And so when you get those tests back, then you want to take those. This one took way too long, obviously. But when you get some of these tests back, you want to look at the average of the duration. And this is duration in seconds, I believe. Yes. So duration in seconds. And the reason this is important is because back at the beginning of your survey, or whenever you do your consent form, you'll have a better idea of realistically, approximately on average, how long will it take somebody to fill this out. Don't put it in seconds, put it in minutes, right? Put the average minutes. But this will give you a much better picture. And I believe, if I recall from a couple of years ago, this one ended up being around the 12-minute mark. So I could safely put in the upfront in the consent form, this survey will take you approximately 10 to 15 minutes. And I knew I wouldn't necessarily be lying there, because on average, it took my people 12 minutes to test. Okay, so I wanted to show you all that. Essentially, what I do when I have finished filtering for whatever my research design calls for, whether partial responses or not, using these two columns, I usually honestly end up going through, you can see that a lot of these, it might matter for your survey design. A lot of times these upfront, it's a lot of metadata. That metadata may matter later on, especially if you have a longitudinal study or a study where you're going back again and asking people to fill out the same survey instrument for you. So you probably want to keep that metadata so that you have those identifiers and you can tag, especially if you're looking at IP addresses and matching those, if that's part of your research design. Always remember these things that could be potential identifiers or that are considered identifiers, like an IP address, need to be disclosed to the participant upfront. But what I was going to say is that what I usually do, especially if I know this is kind of a one and done, with this one, it was really a satisfaction survey. I know I'm just going to use this the one time. I'm going to make my report. I'm probably not going to come back to this data. So when after I export and I'm cleaning it, I go ahead and get rid of all of these up front until I get to my first question set, which is here. So I am going to delete all of those columns so that I can start looking at, it's going to take a minute. So I can start just filtering down for my own eyes and looking at this data set. I can see exactly what I need to be looking at. The next thing that I usually do to try to clean this, remember that you're in an Excel file. Sometimes I have screwed up, and I say sometimes, this is actually a very hard lesson I learned once, is that I exported a file in a CSV format. Instead of saving it as an Excel, I saved it as a CSV file. And then I would go on and do my typical, something I'm going to show you, in that I'm replicating my data sheet over and over so that I can save my data at certain steps in the process. And if I need to go back, I can go back to earlier versions of my spreadsheet. When you do that in a CSV file, it's not necessarily going to warn you that's what you're doing, but CSV files only save the first sheet. So you want to make sure your file format is in an Excel file. So when I do this, what I also usually do, these question numbers could matter, they might matter. But a lot of times what I end up doing is if they don't matter to me, which at this point, this doesn't really matter to me, I'm going to delete that question number because again, I want to cut down on the visual of what I'm seeing in my data to make it a little bit easier for me to clean the data file. Sometimes what I will do is go in and add that back. And then I'm going to look at what the question is, and I'm going to make a reference to what I'm asking for. So I'm going to say academic status at time of transfer. It cuts down a little bit. It's not quite as much with this particular question, but when you get to some of the questions that have a lot more in them, then knowing how to kind of shorthand that in a way that you understand as the researcher what the data is in that column, but making it easier, a little bit easier to look at, maybe, naming it something shorter, and then expanding the column just a little bit. And then maybe then I'm looking at wrapping my text. And so then that just makes it a little bit easier here. Down here on my sheet, I'm going to label this as like maybe first draft all data. And the reason I label it as that is because sometimes, and this is especially true, excuse me, by the way, but this is especially true if you accept partial responses. And you know that some of your question blocks have less responses than some of your other question blocks. Or if you have a display logic only question, sometimes I actually want to pull that entire section of questions out and put it in its own spreadsheet to analyze separately. Okay, so another tip, another trick. I'm happy again. If you are doing, if your research involves survey and you want help cleaning your data because you're using Qualtrics, please let me know. I'm happy to walk through a consultation with you, not only on the back end after you've collected, but while you're setting up your survey questions, because there is sometimes a way that you might want to think about designing your questions in Qualtrics, keeping in mind what's going to export out at the end of that process, what that data is going to look like. And sometimes you can make that easier on yourself. So I'm happy to consult if you have any questions about what this should look like throughout the entirety of the process, from setting up your questions to the very end when you export your data. Okay, so that was a tip and trick. My next best, I say next best, it's my next tip, and it's probably my best tip, is that I really utilize the filter tool to help me clean my data. And I say that, let's look at something super simple so you can see what I'm talking about. So in here, I'm going to use my filter option, which is what this little arrow is. If there is not an arrow, if you export this to Excel, it should automatically include an arrow. But if it does not, all you have to do to get that arrow is go to home. Thank you. I know I'm screen sharing. That's not helpful. Okay, there's a little button over here that is being blocked. There we go. Hang on, let me go back. Okay, home. And then you go to sort and filter, and you want to turn on, right now it's already on, but you want to turn on your filter, and it's going to usually predict your first row is the one that you want to have filter on. Otherwise, if you highlight the row that you want your filter on, then you can set it up that way. So what you want to do is use your filter. Once it's turned on, get that little arrow, go down. Okay, so I want to double check. I use this to not just clean and to filter out, but I use it to double check my data. Right now, what I'm seeing here is that people have answered. This was a multiple choice question. They had to select one. I can see that, and I know that because there's only one option on each of these. If somebody has the option to select multiple in a multiple choice question, we're dealing with a little bit different of a beast when you are cleansing your data for analysis. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But these are the easiest ones to clean. You're really just looking to see if there are any missing answers. And we see that there are, because all of these are checked. So people were able to check these. And then we have blanks. So I'm going to clear out all of these, and I just want to see what the blanks are. Okay, so these are all of my blanks. Okay, I can also see in these blanks, this is my very first question. Most likely, these are all people who initiated the survey, and then clearly you can see there's no additional answers. They never answered one question. So what do I want to do with these? Well, there's no answer. This isn't even looking at like am I recording partial responses versus full responses? There are 0 responses here. So I'm going to go through on these. I'm going to highlight all of these rows because I really want to just get them out of my spreadsheet. There's no reason to have these. Here. And you'll know it's done when you stop seeing the blue. So you can see the difference here. These are all the ones that were included as quote unquote responses in my Qualtrics survey, but they're no response. Also, you can see all of these rows, and this is why I tell people be very, very careful when you're using the analysis, that the reporting feature of Qualtrics. I say that partially because I'm a control freak and I want to know what my data is saying. As a researcher, I want to be the one intimately familiar with my data set. I don't want Qualtrics to tell me what's there because I might not be looking at it in the way that as a researcher, I designed and intended. That's why for me, Qualtrics is a very good data collection tool. And I personally, people might disagree, that's okay. But personally, I believe that Qualtrics is not a good data analysis tool. So for me, I'm going to go ahead and delete these rows. Okay. Okay. So now we see 2 to 4, 4, 7, 8, and we're going to go back up to our filter and look at that. We got rid of all our blanks. So I'm going to select here. That probably, most likely, took out a lot of the additional blanks that we're going to see here. No, I lied. There's still some blanks. So this is something I do just to cleanse. I want to see what's happening here. Okay, this person answered 1 and then they're like, nah, I'm done. Well, that's not super helpful. So because this person answered 0 other ones, I'm also going to delete this one. And most likely because it was high up in my list, it was probably another test case. I'm going to delete that one. The rest of these look like they have some really good data that we want to keep in there, right? So I'm going to go back here. I do have blanks, and because I don't personally like blanks, and depending on the analysis program you use, you may not want to have blanks in there. Blanks might be okay for you. It just kind of depends on what system, what software package you're using after this to analyze. But if I'm using Excel or Power BI, which is what I tend to use if I'm doing descriptive statistics only, then I will try to fill all of my blanks because they show up really funny when you try to do visualizations. Okay, so I'm going to go back. I'm looking at my blanks, and here I'm just going to say, what was my question here? While at orientation, please indicate if you established a connection with, and I'm going to put here, no response. Because it's filtered and we're filtering on the blank, I don't really run any risk of copying over any data in this particular column because it's filtered. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy this down for all of these blanks, I want to say that I had no response instead of highlighting a blank there. Okay, and you can see it copied down. So now that column is clean. And this is what I do. This is the bread and butter. This is why when people say that you need to budget time for analysis, that you actually need to budget your time for analysis, because it's going to take a while to get through, depending on how long your survey was. It can take a while to get through and clean all of your columns. You need to make sure that you really don't want any blanks in there. Again, it depends on your research design. I always advocate for having a filler text, whether it's no response, whether it's not applicable, whether it's, what I would choose, depending on how you ask the question, on what your premise is, on what your ontological views are, even will dictate what you are actually putting and filling into that blank space. So you want to take the time to do that. Again, it's not heavy lifts, but it's time consuming. Two other things I just want to touch on. There's so many other things we could talk about when it comes to how I then replicate my data sets, how I maybe break off my display logic answers and analyze them separately and then reincorporate them into my findings and my reporting. So I can talk about all those things, but just reach out to me individually and we can set up a consultation super easy. I'm happy to do that with anybody here. But really quickly, I just want to talk about two things. I want to talk about, we've been looking at single multiple choice. So I only get one choice. I'm forced to select one answer. I can't select more than one answer when I go through and I respond to this question as a participant. Again, those are the easiest ones to cleanse when they're out of Qualtrics. Let's look at a choose all that apply, which I know for sure in my demographics, my question is, what is your race/ethnicity? Choose all that apply here. The reason we know, so let's say that it did not say choose all that apply, although when you're designing your surveys, as much for the participant, as much for the researcher, for you at the end, when you're cleansing your data, as for the participant, when you're clarifying language for them in the question item, you want to make sure you're super clear. I always put in parentheses, choose all that apply, because not only does it signify to the participant that they can do that in that question and they should do that, but it signifies to me on the back end after I export and I'm needing to cleanse my data that I need to go through and do a different process than just examining it and looking for my blanks. Okay. People are going to go through various stages. Somebody might have a much better way to do this. So I'm just going to show you all what I do when I need to clean a choose all that apply multiple choice. Doesn't mean it's the right way. Doesn't mean it's the only way. It's the way that works for me. It's the way that works in my methodology. So let me show you. And I just want to show you the reason we know that this is a choose all that apply, because if it was not, we would only have one of these categories. There would be American Indian or Alaska Native. Also just know that's along iPads. But those categories are along iPads. Not necessarily what I would have chosen. But we can see here that we have multiple iterations of American Indian or Alaska Native. And that's because every individual was allowed to choose all that apply to them. So this is a more rigorous cleansing process. Again, the way I do it, people might do things differently. Somebody might have figured out how to do this very well. Somebody, if you're working in a system like R, where you can write codes that actually will do the cleansing for you, and if you know how to do that, somebody come teach me how to do that. But if you don't know and you're just doing this by hand, what I recommend doing is going back to your question. And you want to determine what your categories were at the forefront, which might take a minute to load. I'm going to go back to that specific question. I want to see what my categories were. Okay. iPads, right? So American Indian, or Alaska Native. What I want to do here, and this is where I'm going to insert right after that a brand new column. And not just one. I am going to insert, this is taking a minute. My computer doesn't have the bandwidth to do all this. Not just one, I am going to insert 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm going to insert 8 columns. So once I insert, and for every column I insert, I think I might want to highlight that this is a different color, because then I remember that this is something added. This is not exported out of my survey. This was something I added in the process of cleaning for analysis. And I'm going to add 8 of, okay, I'm going to add 8 of them. I'm not actually going to add them right now because my computer is being slow, but what you want to do is add the number of columns you have for the number of single answers that somebody could have chosen. Okay, and the reason that we're going to do that is then we are going, and this is also an added column. I'm going to come in, I'm going to make sure we know that. And then I'm just going to go, one by one. So American Indian or Alaska Native. So that's what this is. So up here, Indian, Alaska Native. And expand it just a little bit. And then I'm going to wrap my text, make it easier. And then what's my next one was Asian. So this column, just to show you all. Okay. A little bit bigger. Okay. What I'm going to do now for every one of these, this is where my binary coding comes in for my data. Okay. And I'll show you what I mean by that. I am going to only select those answers in which somebody answered American Indian or Alaska Native. So I'm only selecting these ones right here. And I'm going to say, okay. And the reason that I'm doing that is then I'm going to put a big old X right here. Because this person answered that they identify as an American Indian Alaska Native, and I want to know that. And I'm going to not do that. Okay, I don't know what happens sometimes. You have to be careful about how we do that. Okay. So then I'm going to drag this down. Sometimes this works really well in that it will allow you to copy without dragging. Sometimes you just have to do the work and drag it down. Okay. All of those people identified as that. Next up, I'm going to go back into my filter function. This is where filter, I really, really leverage the filter function when I'm cleaning because I just think it's easier. And what I want to do is go here. And now I want to see, I'm going to unselect all, and then I'm going to select Asian. And so everywhere that there was Asian is then where I'm going to put my X here. So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to filter this down. Not filter, sorry, drag this down. It'll take just a second. Again, it's not hard. It's time consuming. Okay, so these are all the people that indicated somewhere in their answer Asian. Okay. What then I want to do, so after I've gone through and I've done all of that using this column, and sometimes with this column, I will do this an entirely different color too, especially when I have 8 of these additional columns that I'm using to clean. Then I want to come in here and I want to do this one, just a totally different color. So don't forget that this is the one I'm coming back to filter on. So now let me clear this filter. I'm going to select all. And the reason I'm doing that is then I want to come to this column. So I've already cleaned for this column. All of my American Indian Alaska Native are here. So one of the things I put was X. The other thing I could do, let's change this X to say yes. That's how I identify. So instead of X, we're going to say yes. Drag. And the reason we're going to do that is because then on our binary, and again, it depends on what software program you're using after for statistical analysis. If you're using SPSS, you might want to use a binary like 0, 1. I'm just thinking about using Power BI for descriptive, so I'm going to use yes, no. So if they're not yes, then they're not identifying that way. And so all these blanks in this particular column are going to be no's. And we are going to go ahead and drag. It's going to take a little bit longer. That one's taking a while, but you get the picture. So all of these, let's pretend like I was able to. Again, time is something you want to budget for cleaning your data. But what we have here, what we will have is that people will either have identified as American Indian Alaska Native, or they have not. So that can be very helpful when you're looking at maybe if you're wanting to do inferential statistics, or you want to drop this into SPSS, if you want to do it on a binary of 0, 1, where 0 is no and 1 is yes, or if you want to do yes and no, if you're going to drop it into a visualization software or just use Excel to measure that. So I wanted to show you that because it's a little more involved. Oh, I must have done this when it was filtered. It's a little more involved when you have multiple choice that are select all that apply. And so you just have to know that going in. Again, it's one of the things that I not even caution, because they have their place. Those questions have their place. I think they're very important in some ways, but I try to limit the amount of questions that I ask for people to mark all that apply, especially if there's a lot of answers. We have 8 answers on this one that somebody could have marked, but if you have something like 40, that's going to take you a while to get through when you're cleaning. And I would definitely dedicate the time that you need to go through your computation here, or your cleansing, sorry, not your computation, your cleansing here. So just something to think about. Quickly, another tip and trick I have is, by nature, I am a very proud, I like qualitative research. I don't mind quantitative. I like it too. I'm a numbers girl, but I really enjoy qualitative, and I really enjoy understanding what somebody is saying and getting their perspective on a matter. With that, I tend to ask, even in surveys, I ask a lot of open-ended questions. And I know that when I do that, I'm going to have this whole other process I'm going to go through, especially if I want to signify and put a number or an analysis data point on those open-ended answers. So just one of the things that then I do, if I have an open-ended, I can tell this is an open-ended one because you can just tell these are not any choices that I would have put into a multiple choice. It looks like an open-ended. So let's look at the question. What can we do to improve orientation? Obviously open-ended. What I tend to do here, again, this does take a while. You want to budget your time for this. You can move all of your open-ended into a separate sheet or a separate workbook, save it, put it into a qualitative computer analysis software like in Vivo or QDA Minor. But because I already have it in Excel, usually what I end up doing is just as I'm analyzing, I'm going through and inductively, I'm creating codes here. And so this is, okay, tours. This is what we can do to improve orientation. I know this is the one that I'm working on. It's a brand new field. So I'm going to mark it separately so I can keep track of the ones that I am doing. Make day 2 less brutal. I don't know what to say about that. Not be so early. So maybe no early start. So you can see I'm going through nothing. It's best to have anything in one day. So 2, even though it's extremely long day. 1 day orientation, right? So you can see I'm going through, I'm inductively coding these. And as I start to get down here, I am going to, again, use my filter and use the fact that it will start to autofill something that I've already put in there, and use the autofill to help me code through these open-ended answers. Again, it takes a while. You don't have to do it like this. It's just the way that I do it. But if you're going to be true to your data and you're going to see what people said and not just like export your list and make everybody read it, but you want to actually do a little bit of coding and demonstrate what people have said, then you can go through and do this coding on your own. And I just do it in Excel. Even though if it's a larger body of text, I like to use in Vivo or QDA Minor. So anyway, those are just a few of my like best tips and tricks. And again, a lot of this is in how you set up the survey in the very first place. So if you are out there and you're using Qualtrics for your research and you want some help with designing your questions with a data management principle in mind in the beginning, I'm happy to help you with design. And then if you have finished and you're exporting and you get the spreadsheet and you're like, oh my God, what do I do now? And you need help, reach out to me, please. So that was probably longer than I think I anticipated going for this shorter portion. But I hope that it was helpful and gave you some helpful insight into how to start your cleansing process of your data upon export from Qualtrics. Reach out to me if you have any questions, and I'll see you at the next boot camp.